here with my co-chairman, Bob Bauer. And Bob, any opening comments?
No, we thank the witnesses for coming. We look forward to an excellent hearing.
We have a very distinguished panel to start us off, and Secretary John Husted, Secretary of State of Ohio. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you today. Mr. Bauer and Mr. Ginsburg and members of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, welcome to Ohio. On behalf of the people of Ohio, who, by the way, welcome the 10-month reprieve from TV commercials and robocalls, we want to welcome you to perhaps the nation's most important swing state. November 2012 was my first presidential election as Ohio Secretary of State. Even though I knew I had assembled a great team, had confidence in the abilities of our 88 county bipartisan boards of elections, I was comfortable that we had prepared for all known contingencies. However, I also carried a healthy amount of caution going into that election day. But there was one moment early on when I knew it was going to be just fine. With just a few minutes in between meetings, I flipped on the news. Much of the coverage at that point had been about long lines in Florida, and CNN was just concluding another segment about it. The anchor threw back to a reporter who was live from a polling location in Blue Ash, Ohio, which is actually not very far from where we are today. In the background shot, you could see some voters casting their ballots, but there were also vacant booths and no lines to speak of. The reporter turned to one of our poll workers and asked what he thought about what was going on in the Sunshine State. Without missing a beat, this poll worker quipped, "Tell them to come to Ohio and we'll show them how to do it." And I thought to myself, that's right on. We do know how to do it, and everything went fine that day. However, I'm not here to pick on Florida, and Ohio's successes certainly didn't happen by chance. Improving Ohio's election system has been a process. We have worked very hard to improve the way our state runs its elections. But we also had to learn some tough lessons, especially following the 2004 presidential election, when Ohio saw long lines at a handful of precincts. If you think of voting like a highway system, you have one of two ways to alleviate traffic. You can add lanes, in this case voting machines, or you can reduce the cars on the road during the rush hour, and in this analogy, the number of voters going to the polls at the same time. Following the 2004 election, we chose the latter by adopting a no-fault absentee voting system. I served as Ohio's House Speaker during this time and supported this reform. Our goal was to take some of the pressure off the polling locations, the polling places on Election Day, by giving voters a chance to vote an absentee ballot in the weeks leading up to the election. From the time we changed the law until now, absentee voting has continued to grow in popularity with voters and elections officials alike, although it's worth noting that that growth rate has slowed. In early voting, we have, as far as early voting, we have expanded opportunities for in-person and mail-in voting, and I would direct you to a map that's in your packets. You can see that Ohio has more expansive voting opportunities than any other state, including states like New York, that where a lot of people like to have opinions about what happens in Ohio. You see, in Ohio, we take our status as a swing state very seriously. Every 4 years, unlike a pure red or a pure blue state, Ohio's election system goes under the national microscope. My priority has been to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And despite the high level of scrutiny we endured on both fronts in 2012, I am proud that we were able to deliver a smooth and fair election. On the easy to vote side, it is easy to vote in Ohio. In fact, Ohio is a leader in voting access. With no-fault absentee voting, Ohioans were able to cast ballots over the course of 5 weeks. Voting starts here 35 days before the election. And they were able to do this without ever leaving home. In Ohio, you don't even need to leave home to vote. If a voter waited in a line in Ohio, it was by choice. Why? Because for the first time ever in our state, my office sent absentee ballot applications to all registered voters statewide who had a current address on file with us. About 6.9 million absentee ballot requests went out to voters in our state. Other than the states who vote exclusively by mail, Ohio was the only state to go to such lengths to make it convenient for voters to participate. Ohio voters also benefited from more online services, including a new online change of address system, and a higher percentage of provisional ballots were counted in 2012 as compared to 2008. In fact, according to the EAC's data, Ohio had one of the lowest rejection rates in the nation. And I want to point something out with provisional ballots, if I could. Provisional ballots are not second-class ballots, they're second-chance ballots. In Ohio, and in a lot of other states, for example, if you showed up at your local polling location and you had moved to Cincinnati from Cleveland, so in a lot of states they would say, well, you're registered in Cleveland, go vote there. But obviously on election day that makes it pretty hard to do. What we do in Ohio to make sure that voters are voting in the correct location and on the correct issues, we accept a provisional ballot for them in that case, and then validate after the fact their address and their eligibility to vote there. We try to make it, do everything we can to bend over backwards to qualify voters to cast a ballot. On the hard-to-cheat side, we have also worked to ensure the integrity of our election system, leveraging technology to dramatically improve the accuracy of our voter rolls. And following the election, we issued the first ever statewide report on voter fraud and voter suppression to give all Ohioans confidence that the rules were followed and their votes were not diluted by those seeking to game this system. Accurate voter rolls are the backbone of a smooth and fair election. Accurate, up-to-date voter rolls ensure this fair and smooth election, and I'm pleased to report that Ohio's voter rolls are in the best shape they have been since Ohio first created the statewide voter registration database. When I took office, we had complete information on only 20% of the voters. Only 20% of the voters did we have complete information on. But because of our partnership that we created with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles and our efforts to build the infrastructure to share data between the two agencies, which no one had ever tried to do before, we now have complete information on 86% of the voters. In 2 short years, we have more than quadrupled the amount of voter information available. This is important because the data is used to validate a voter's eligibility or lack thereof. We were the first state to use the STEVE database from the National Association of Public Health Statistics and Information Systems, which includes death records not just from Ohio, but from other states' departments of health. This allows us to legally and accurately remove deceased voters from the rolls. Since I took office, boards have verified and removed more than 237,000 deceased voters from our voter rolls. Our county boards have also been diligent about processing duplicate registrations. In January of 2011, there were more than 340,000 duplicate records identified. Just before the 2012 election, we were down to 1,400, from 340,000 to 1,400, and the boards just keep plugging along. And following the election, our work to clean up Ohio's voter list also allowed us to use the interstate cross-check system championed by Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach to research and refer approximately 20 voters who we believe have voted in Ohio and in another state during the 2012 election. This system currently shares data with 22 states. We hope more states will participate in the future, but without good data, this would not have been possible. It's why the data work that we did in advance was very important. Our new online change of address system has also played a major role in efforts to keep voter records up to date. We know that the most common reason a voter must cast a provisional rather than a regular ballot is because they did not update their address information. In Ohio, we are working to empower voters to keep their information current. They need only go online at myohiovote.com. It is very easy and very convenient. Just prior to the election, we took it a step further, proactively sending postcards to Ohioans who we knew had moved, encouraging them to update their address online. And this year, Ohio boards conducted the federally mandated national change of address process. For the first time, boards were able to give the voters the option of updating their information online, making it easier for them to stay on the rolls in this particular circumstance. In 1 year's time, nearly 126,000 Ohioans have used the new system, and we expect that that number will steadily grow in coming years as Ohioans become more aware of it. The next logical step to this, though, is the implementation of full online voter registration. For 3 years, I have been pushing the General Assembly in Ohio to pass this legislation. I see it as an opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to find common ground. It's infinitely more convenient for voters than the paper system and more secure because it allows for real-time verification of eligibility. The online system is also more efficient and less costly for boards of elections, not to mention more accurate as there's less data entry for the voters, and there's less data entry and the voters control their own information. If the legislature finally takes action, it will save taxpayers millions of dollars and will be in keeping with our goal of making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Military voting is something that also we have made a lot of changes in, I'm very proud of. One of our best practices that I always like to share with my colleagues from other states is our Military Ready to Vote program. We've worked closely with all branches of the military and military organizations to distribute voting materials and to educate military families on what they need to know to participate in Ohio elections, no matter where they are stationed in the world or in the United States. August marked the 2-year anniversary of our program. To date, we have received more than 2,400 federal postcard applications from military and overseas Ohioans stationed around the world in 35 states, 15 countries, and even 6 naval ships. Our efforts were recognized by the Association of the U.S. Army and the Military Voter Protection Project deemed Ohio as an all-star state. That's a status we wear as a badge of honor and plan to keep building on it for the future. Poll worker recruitment and training is a final topic that I want to talk about and is really an important one. Recruitment and training of good poll workers for Election Day remains a major focus in Ohio. Poll workers are the front lines in elections and the face of elections for most of the voters in Ohio. In 2012, we needed an army of about 40,000 to staff more than 4,800 polling locations. Though recruitment, hiring, and training is the responsibility of the 88 county boards of elections, the Secretary of State's office works to support boards and our poll workers. In 2012, though, only new poll workers were required by law to go through training. But by directive, we extended this requirement to all poll workers, new and old, in all counties. To help, we distributed $760,000 in poll worker training funds to the boards, and over the past 2 years to assist these efforts. We provide print and online resources free of charge to boards of elections outlining the proper policies and procedures poll workers must follow. We created a website, peoinohio.com, where we house all of our training resources and materials where potential poll workers can sign up. And as of April 2012, my office forwarded more than 1,800 potential poll workers to county boards so that we can continue to try to recruit talent and improve the talent of the people working at our polls. I want to conclude with some recommendations to the Commission. After every election, I believe it is wise to reflect on the lessons we learned. What should be changed, or even more astutely, to remind ourselves not to try to fix what isn't broken. I believe that's why you have taken time to come to Ohio today. In your worthy desire to make elections run more smoothly in federal election years, I would encourage you to give due respect to the authority of the states to run elections in the best manner for our voters year-round in local, state, and federal elections. I will note for you that in Ohio, we have voting or the counting of votes going on 300 of 365 days a year, as we have 4 elections a year in Ohio. The attention only gets paid, though, to 1 out of every 16 of those elections at the national level. But we have talented election officials running elections 300 of 365 days a year. I also believe that the Ohio State House, not Congress or the federal courthouse, is the proper place to set voting policy for the people of Ohio. Before entertaining new ideas, I encourage you to help us in addressing some of the shortcomings of previous federal efforts to improve elections, namely the underfunded voting machine mandate and what I believe to be the contradictory provisions of the National Voter Registration Act that have led to bloated voter rolls. In 2002, the federal government got involved with the machines we now use to vote. It was initially funded, but now, more than 10 years later, these machines are aging, they need maintenance, and at some point will need to be replaced. The next time we go to the polls to elect a president, these machines will be 12 years old. That's a lifetime when it comes to technology. The cost of this falls on an already strapped local governments. Rather than passing new election requirements, Congress should either fully fund HAVA or commit to long-term funding to maintain accurate, transparent, and independently tested voting systems, or remove the mandate and return it to the states and local governments. Additionally, our population is far more transient, I believe, than the National Voter Registration Act contemplated, and was written before we were able to leverage the technology we can today, which I referred to earlier. It relies on a mail system when there are much faster ways for us to communicate with voters and the voters with us. As Secretary of State, I want to keep eligible voters on the rolls, but also to meet the charge of keeping the rolls accurate and up to date. I have written the U.S. Justice Department on numerous times to help us resolve this contradiction in federal law. Ohio is the subject of pending litigation because some Ohio counties, which based on the last census had more registered voters than people of voting age. Let me reiterate that. That is more voters on the rolls than voting age population, not more actual voters, which has become a popular internet myth. This is a hard thing to explain to a skeptical public, but elections officials are largely powerless under the NVRA to remove even voters we know have moved on, even to other states, because we must wait for them to be inactive for 2 federal cycles. The Justice Department has not provided the direction in resolving this matter, and any help you can provide us on bringing more clarity to our charge under the NVRA would be appreciated. Finally, I believe that the great strides we have made in Ohio in just a few years on leveraging technology to improve list maintenance can provide a model for other states in cleaning up the country's voter rolls. Data sharing between states can and should be encouraged by this commission to ensure our voter rolls nationwide are up to date and accurate. It will prevent fraud, and it will do the most to reduce lines and make Election Day run more smoothly everywhere. I am honored to work with you on this charge in this area and pursuing these recommendations that you will be issuing to the President. In the words of the poll worker I mentioned at the beginning, tell them to come to Ohio and we'll show them how it's done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Next, we have the top election officers in 2 states. Let's begin with the home state of Ohio, Matt Damschroeder.
Good morning, Commissioners. Since the Secretary has done a great job outlining what we have done in Ohio, particularly in the 2012 election, I'll be very brief and just kind of underscore again some of the points that he made. Most importantly, the role of data in elections administration. As you all know, voter registration, as the Secretary mentioned, is the backbone of elections administration, and having accurate rolls is kind of the entrance point for voters to participate in their democratic process. Unfortunately, as the Secretary noted, NVRA, whether individuals are proponents or opponents, NVRA did kind of cement into federal law processes that are now out of date and are not the way that Americans interact with almost any other activity in their daily lives, whether it's changing the address or entities like the government canceling records for deceased voters, et cetera. There are a number of opportunities, I think, to improve the data of elections administration as it relates to voter registration. As the Secretary mentioned, online voter registration, I think, is one of those important ways. Arizona has kind of showed us both the way to do it and the cost savings for local and state elections officials. And here in Ohio, we're working hard to do that. Also, as it relates to the importance of data, I think we have two great models out there nationally right now. Obviously, one is the collection of election statistics by the EAC. The other is the Survey of the Performance of American Elections by Charles Stewart, which I think is an important thing that allows us to, as states, to judge how well we're doing and performing. And then I would close with a comment about training. The Secretary mentioned it. As elections officials, one of the things that has been important for me to consider, having been a county election official for a number of years and now having the opportunity to work with Secretary Husted at the state, is that there is turnover in local elections officials. The Larry Lomaxes of the world are not the norm for local elections administration, I think, across the country. And in Ohio, the turnover from the 2008 presidential election to the 2012 election was significant enough that Secretary Husted had us develop almost a remedial education program to a certain extent for local election officials, where we went back and talked about every aspect of election preparation. And I think that was one of the things that contributed, as well as training poll workers, as the Secretary mentioned, is one of the important pieces that we need to consider. The processes, the technology of elections administration at that most granular level is something that I think a number of people have spearheaded that over the years and kept elections running. But I think we need to view precinct election officialdom as a civic duty. That is something that we need to enlist, and Secretary Husted is working hard on this in Ohio, to enlist our corporate community, our labor community, our charitable community, so that this is something that at the county and local level, that it is viewed as a thing of honor and a thing of making our process work. So with that, I'll close, and obviously happy to answer any questions later on that you may have for the Secretary. All right.
Thank you, Matt. Kevin Kennedy is the Executive Director of the Government Accountability Board in Wisconsin, and as I believe that's the right title, and as one of the senior election officials in the country, has been of great help to the Commission, both collectively and individually. Kevin, thank you for coming, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Co-Chairs Bauer, Ginsburg, Commission members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. It's a tremendous honor to be here. When this country was founded, we placed our trust in our citizens to shape its governance. Voters have been given a powerful means to determine how our country moves forward. That is done by casting a vote at the polling place, at an early voting location, by mail, or through some other means. As we craft laws and develop administrative procedures for elections, we have to focus on the principle that the voters and their right to participate in the political process is paramount. We've come a long way in empowering our citizens by eliminating barriers of religion, property, race, sex, income, and age as impediments to full participation in choosing our elected representatives. The United States serves as a model for the world in enabling its citizens to shape the governance of this country. Within our states and territories, our counties and municipalities, election administrators are working diligently and passionately to ensure voters are able to fully participate in the democratic process. As Wisconsin's chief election officer for the past 30 years, I take great pride in my state's consistently high rankings in the surveys of voter turnout and other measures of effective election administration. How do we do that? We have a lot of help from our local election partners. Wisconsin has 72 county clerks and 1,852 municipal clerks who run elections in the state. They recruit and train approximately 2,800 chief election inspectors for each polling location and another 35,000 poll workers to staff those locations. They draw on data, use technology, and bring an unabated commitment to serve the voter. Paying attention to election-related data helps improve the voting experience for the public. Our focus has always been to serve the voters first. By doing so, we also serve the candidates and all the other constituencies and interest groups who are involved in elections. Know your numbers is something we continually preach to local election officials. Knowing how many people turned out in past elections is a good predictor of how many will show up in the future, and that tells you how many ballots to order to avoid running out, how to divide your poll books to avoid long lines, and how many election inspectors to schedule. Paying attention to the numbers enables our clerks to equip and staff polling places to minimize the wait time for voters. Knowing your numbers is also critical on election night after the polls close. Our local election officials tell us they can look at a list of unofficial returns and immediately spot potential problems at individual polling places that may have been caused by someone transposing a number or a voting equipment malfunction. Getting election-related data from all those local election officials was a challenge for us for many years. 2/3 of our clerks are part-time and many work out of their homes. All of them have other pressing responsibilities besides election administration. State law requires clerks after each statewide election to fill out an elections, voting, and registration statistics report, affectionately known as the GAB 190. In the past, these forms came back in paper format by mail and fax, and making it very difficult for us not only to get the big picture, but also to delve into the details. That changed in 2008 when we developed an online data collection tool. Now Wisconsin's local election officials enter all their statistical reporting online, allowing us to track who has and has not filed and to complete a detailed analysis of the results. We match this data against numbers in our statewide voter registration system and the official canvas of election results to measure data quality. In addition to the reports on the numbers and types of voters, our system collects information on poll workers. It's one thing to say anecdotally that many poll workers are of retirement age. It's another to be able to say, as we can, that 39.5% are age 61 to 70 and 34.1% are age 71 and above. That kind of information guides our training methods and our efforts to recruit younger poll workers, including high school students. One polling place innovation our agency initiated in 1984 was the establishment of flexible hours for poll workers. Wisconsin law permits municipalities to allow for 2 or more sets of election inspectors to work at different times on election day. This flexibility enables municipal clerks to recruit and retain more poll workers because they do not have to work 15 or 16-hour shifts on election day. As you may have heard, in 2011 and 2012, Wisconsin was quite busy with a series of 13 recall elections. As the public debated the wisdom of recall, one question that came up frequently was how much the recall elections cost taxpayers. Because we had the election data collection system in place, we were able to add questions about election costs to the GAB 190. As a result, we now are able to produce detailed reports on election costs. Our hope is that having these numbers will inform lawmakers and local government leaders about the resources necessary to conduct successful elections. Using our data collection system, we have documented cost data for the past 7 statewide election events in Wisconsin, dating back to April of 2012. Anyone can readily access this data through the statistical report put together for each statewide election. Wisconsin is also in the forefront of electronic absentee ballot delivery to our servicemen and women and to citizens permanently living overseas. Our My Vote Wisconsin voter portal is able to securely deliver an absentee ballot to members of the military and permanent overseas voters. This innovation has eliminated the need for overseas voters to find and contact the municipal clerk's office to request a ballot and has cut in half the transit time for UOCAVA ballots. In addition, our My Vote Wisconsin site also allows any voter to check their voter registration status, find their polling place, and begin the voter registration process online. Wisconsin has embarked on a unique program of auditing polling places on election day to ensure compliance with HAVA and the ADA. We look at real-world conditions likely to be encountered by voters with disabilities. Each election day, the GAB sends out auditors across the state to visit as many polling places as possible. Our auditors carry tablet computers they use to enter their findings and take pictures of problems they find. Our audits categorize 3 levels of accessibility problems: high, medium, and low severity. High severity problems represent a barrier that in and of itself would be likely to prevent a voter with a disability from entering a polling place or casting the ballot privately and independently. Examples we found include everything from snow piles in handicapped accessible parking spots and locked wheelchair accessible building doors to accessible voting equipment being set up on tables that were too high, not plugged in, or not set up at all. Identifying and fixing these accessibility issues helps not only voters with disabilities, but can also lead to a more orderly and efficient polling place for everyone. If a polling place is too cramped for someone in a wheelchair to navigate, it's very likely too cramped, period. Finally, the foundation for an efficient and easy voting experience must engage the voter well before Election Day. Congress and many state legislators have given a renewed and almost continuous focus on changing election laws in recent years. The way that the partisan debates and legislative compromises play out in the practical world of conducting elections and voting can present a challenge. In its 2-year legislative session leading up to the 2012 presidential election, the Wisconsin legislature enacted 11 separate election-related bills. In some cases, multiple bills altered the same procedures. The sheer volume of changes, along with their unusual number of additional elections, made it harder for both local election officials and voters to understand the required procedures and what to expect on Election Day. Procedures that are not well understood are more likely to encourage uncertainty and even suspicion amongst those who are skeptical of the process. In 2012, in addition to training our local election officials regarding the many legislative changes, our staff implemented a comprehensive Back to Basics program to remind both election officials and voters about the fundamental rules of voting. Our Voting 101 Back to Basics outreach program produced user-friendly resources, and our staff also engaged in speaking opportunities throughout the state to meet directly with voters and organizations focused on educating voters. I provided the Commission with links and data related to our data collection, our disability access monitoring, as well as our training materials. And those links are in my prepared testimony that's been given to you, and Professor Pursley has the actual data sets. I hope you do them. In closing, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some of the data-driven solutions developed in Wisconsin, along with the passion and commitment our dedicated core of state and local election officials brings to this essential process for securing our democracy. While elections are often evaluated and measured by numbers, in the end, it's really all about the voter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Next is Doug Lewis, the Executive Director of the Election Center, and as such, in that role, which has as its members many state and local election officials, Doug has always had his finger on the pulse of what the election officials are thinking and needing. So thank you for coming, Mr. Lewis, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you all for inviting us and having us talk to you a little bit about this. And in fact, I'm glad, Chairman Ginsburg, that you said that, because of the officials that you've got appearing, election officials you've got appearing today, all of them are members of the Election Center, and 90% of them are graduate of the certification program to become professional certified election registration administrators, including both Matt and Kevin on this panel. And so we're looking at trying to find ways to help you. You all have a tough role here in terms, it's sort of like being a mosquito in a nudist colony. Where do you start, And so the problem that you've got as you go through this is trying to find out what is it you need to focus on, what is it will really be useful and helpful and serve the community well and serve voters well. And that's what we look at continuously. The beauty of working in this profession is as I work with people who truly believe in making democracy work for voters. Election and registration administrators try their darndest to make this process work. Now, are we always successful? No. Have we screwed up on occasion? Yes, but we're pretty quick studies. We learn pretty well, we react pretty well, we respond. It's rare for us to keep repeating the same mistakes, although with Charles Stewart's data, we've seen that at least a couple of states have got repeat problems. Those problems are not always the result of administration, however. And I provided you all with an article that we did for the Council of State Governments on what are those elements, and part of those elements are beyond our control, quite frankly. The parts that are policy development, the parts that are funding development, the parts of the politics of election administration, of getting, of decisions that sometimes make no sense for voters but make sense for political parties. Those kinds of things are beyond our control in order to shape those. We have to end up with whatever all of those groups end up doing and affecting us in terms of either that they restrict our budget or they give us policies that don't make a lot of sense, or they insist on political solutions that don't make a lot of sense for all voters in terms of fairness. And we still try to shape an election process that works for most voters. Now, in election 2012 and election 2008, in 2008 there was a different attitude. The voters that waited in line were absolutely happy to be waiting in line, and in 2012 they were not quite so happy to be waiting in line. And so it's amazing how a 4-year shift in some of this can change the way we look at this. I will say to you, it is not okay for elections administrators, and none of us feel that it is okay to have voters waiting 2 and 3 and 5 and 8 hours. That just makes no sense. And we have to find ways to fix that and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. The parts that are administrative parts, we'll do something about. We'll try to figure out how to do that, and we're going to look to you all for suggestions and ideas, and if you come up with something, if you tell us that learning to play tic-tac-toe will help us figure out how to make this work better, we're going to at least try tic-tac-toe for a while. We may not end up using it long-term, but at least we'll try it. We're looking for ideas in order to make sure this works for voters, and so we will do what we can. You know, Kevin mentioned legislatures doing what they do. As you all discovered, I think, in probably your first hearing when you went to Florida and you had that first hearing and you discovered that a legislature decides to put on 11 constitutional amendments and a whole bunch of local bond issues and wonders why in a presidential year with, 3 or 4 languages and 7-page ballot that voters somehow can't get through the process. Well, those are things that we don't control. Now, we maybe should have known how long it was going to take for each voter to vote that and how many voters we could process by hour, and maybe that's our fault, and certainly we need to look in the mirror when it is our fault to look on these. But those are the things that we look at in trying to figure out how do we do this well for voters and how do we make this well for voters. Early voting. We've got 32 states now doing some form of early voting. Early voting is one of those that tends to relieve our pressures on election day. But now let me say to you, it also stretches our resources. To do mail voting, in-person voting on election day, and early voting means that we've got to have more people involved in the process. We've got to have more equipment. We've got to have more resources. We stretch our resources during that period leading up to election, and you hope that your legislature has been smart enough to end early voting 3 or 4 days prior to election day so you get your best people back into the process. If they insist on us voting through that last weekend, as some bright judge did in Ohio, you end up causing problems for the elections process, therefore causing problems for voters. And so these are the kinds of things that we're faced with. And I will say to you, if you go to making recommendations on early voting, if you go to making those kinds of recommendations on early voting, please don't try to tell them exactly how to do it. You may want to say to them it's a good idea. You may want to say to them we encourage it, but let them figure out how to do it. Chris is going to know more about how to do it in his state. Matt's going to know more how to do it in his state. Kevin, when Ann was there and when Tammy's been there, you know more about what you can do to serve your voters at those locales, and you are better able to serve those voters at locales. And as I said to you yesterday, turning things over to the federal government doesn't, in a lot of instances, doesn't make sense. They move with a pace, heck, a snail is fast compared to the federal government. This is one of those things that we have to look at. Look, I've been at this for public policy work for about 40 years and been involved in elections for most of that period of time, and I've been at the Election Center for 20 of those years, and I will say to you, every election administrator I have met in this country wants to do the right thing for voters. They want to make this process a good experience, and they will work to make it a good experience if we're given the resources and the policies and don't end up with insane political decisions that happen when legislatures decide to pass legislation in an election year and then want it implemented in an election year. One of the things we were able to convince Congress of when they passed the 2002 Help America Vote Act was not to make it instantly applicable, so that we could go through a period of time of making the adjustments and learning the things that we needed to learn in order to make this process work well for voters. Political parties, look, I'm glad two of the great partisans of the country are on this panel. And you all have some influence even over your own political parties. Your political parties, the political partisans of both of your parties, keep alleging that the process is broken. At some point, you begin to make the public believe that the process is broken. And if the parties cannot at least prove their allegations, instead of a bunch of anecdotal evidence, and anecdotal evidence, guys, is not data. And the plural of anecdotes is not data. And so the fact that they build up them and talk to them and talk about them as if they are fact is absolute horsepucky. We are at the point that we need to understand partisanship has its place. But if we damage the process and the fundamental faith in the process, nobody gets to believe in the government that results from it. That doesn't make sense. Somehow, we've got to get the two political parties to tone down that application of alleging that the process is broken or the process cheats voters or the process cheats democracy or what have you. This is too important. Democracy can be lost. The Greeks had it before we did. They lost it. It disappears for 2,000 years off the face of the planet. So it can be lost. It's one of those that is important for us to do the right things. In terms of military and overseas voters, we have made gigantic improvements in terms of how we do that. We have, at last count, 2 and maybe 4 states that have not really done all that they could do to make this process work, and they seem to be repeat offenders in this. We're for, the elections profession, is for government prosecuting those that don't do what the law says. But we don't need a whole bunch more new laws on military and overseas voting in order to make this work for voters. We can absolutely get to the problem, and we have, it looks to me, been able to have the states design their responses to this and make this process easier. And so anybody who doesn't meet that 45-day deal, I don't care what their excuse is, then prosecute them. Move on. Accessible voting. Accessible voting, we have lost our way a little bit. We thought we had in the Help America Vote Act an approach that was going to get us to the point that we could make voters with access needs have a good experience at this. And we lost that in this discussion of safety and security of electronic systems and discouraging the use of electronic systems and somehow separating out that accessible voters need to vote on something separate than all the other voters. Guys, part of the way folks have gotten away with this is because we've assumed that accessible voters are a small percentage of the American public. Well, depending on if you look at the most conservative estimates, there's 36 million Americans that have some kind of accessible need. If you look at the ones that are a little larger than that, it's almost 60 million Americans have some form of accessible needs. And we've got an aging population. Shoot, I'm almost old enough to be a poll worker now. I'm getting to the point that I understand these issues. And that 18-year cohort of people who is identified as baby boomers are all coming to the fore now. And most of us have got some kind of accessibility issue. And we're living longer. God knows, I know some people hope that I don't live terribly longer, but at the same time, I will say to you, if they're living 20 years longer or 25 years longer, and we're a huge cohort in terms of the voting public, accessibility issues are going to be a major problem going forward for the next 20 to 25 to 30 years. And it's no longer going to be looking at saying that this is 10% of the public. This is now going to be more like 55% of the public, and particularly of the voting public, because that's who votes best. Poll worker training or poll worker recruitment. Look, I've been at this 40 years. I will say to you, I have heard for 40 years that we somehow need better poll workers and we need better trained poll workers. They're better trained now than they were 40 years ago. They're better trained now than they were 30 years ago and 20 years ago and 10 years ago, because we've learned more about how adults learn and how adults respond to education and what have you. And so we've done that. But better connotes choice, as if we have too many to select from. When we get to our urban areas, there's not choice. If they breathe, they serve. And if they die while they're at the table, we don't tell anybody until the election's over. We need them. And so trying to say to us that we need better poll workers is wonderful if you're talking about most of America. It's not wonderful if you're talking about urban America, because no matter how many of them we recruit, a certain segment of them, 5%, 7%, 10%, are not going to show up when they said they were going to. And then we have to backfill. And that's when lines start to develop, is because we didn't know which of those precincts they weren't going to show up in until they don't show up. And so part of that problem is how do we do that? Better training of poll workers. I think we're already there. And in fact, the one thing that all of us need to look at is we're asking too much of poll workers now. We're expecting them to be technologists. We're expecting them to be psychologists. We're expecting them to be meeters and greeters and wonderful people. And we're expecting them to administer an election and make the process work. And we have overloaded what their capabilities are with 2 hours of training. And so we need to think about how do we do this better, not necessarily how much more we can add on to them. And so let me wrap this up. America is a resilient democracy. We've learned a little something in 237 years of administering this process. We didn't get suddenly stupid in terms of how to do this. We make some mistakes. We adjust pretty quickly. We want to get it right. We want to make it work. If you give us some ideas, you give us some tools, you give us some recommendations, we'll be happy with those. We may not agree with everything you do. We may not agree with every suggestion you make, but I guarantee you we'll take it to heart, we'll look at it, we'll see does it have an application, we'll try some of it, we'll figure out what works and what doesn't work, and we'll move on. We thank you all for what you're doing in terms of serving the country to make this better for voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Questions from members of the commission? Commissioner Grayson.
Secretary Husted and Director Damschroeder, I guess John referenced the DMV closer relationship, and I just wanted to know if the two of you could kind of dive a little bit deeper into that. What did you do? Were there pitfalls? Will you have recommendations for other states that are trying to pursue this partnership to get the databases talking to one another or sharing the data, whatever you did, because it sounds like it's pretty successful. And the situation that y'all find yourself in, where the DMV has one list, y'all have another. It's not like Michigan or some of these other states where it's maybe easy to cooperate. Just curious what lessons and the guidance and advice you provide.
Well, I will have Matt go into the technical aspects of it, but I can tell you it was largely technical in that the two computer systems didn't talk to one another, and we had to design a system where they could, and we could share that data, and you're going to need to make sure that the laws in your state allow you to share that data. In many cases, secretaries of state are also oversee the BMV. In those states, it's easier. In Ohio, we do not.
Right.
And so we had to build those working relationships. We have been long-standing trying to make sure that the BMV follows motor voter and the requirements of motor voter. Ohio was not in compliance with motor voter up until the last year, where we were able to create the system and to do that. If you're going to have, it's just the best place to get the data that you need to be able to track a voter based on the key pieces of data that we use. For example, if you want to vote an absentee ballot, we want you to have your name, your address, your date of birth, either your driver's license number or the last 4 digits for your social security number, and your signature. We didn't have that data for 80% of the voters when I took office. The only place to get access to that information was through BMV, and we had to build that relationship and to create the technology so that it could talk to one another. It's all part of trying to build that system. And Matt,
Can I follow up on the relationship side? Since you're in your first term and the governor's in his first term, was this something that maybe had started under prior administrations, or just, it was new people, fresh start? I mean, because the relationship piece, the silo piece is, I know from my old job, silos are huge in state government.
Well,
And they don't often care because it's not, quote, their job.
we had a little bit of advantage in that it was not started before, but the head of the agency is somebody who I knew from my work in state government. One of the top people over there worked in the Secretary of State's office for the previous Secretary of State and had moved over there. So so there was an awareness that we had that didn't previously exist. And let's face it, if you're, no one pays attention to elections until the election happens. It's really, but all of these things need to be built when no one's paying attention. And to get people's attention about how important this is a trick. Because law enforcement has a lot of other issues that they deal with on a daily basis. The BMV has other issues. They have other things to do. And to get that attention and to get them to make this a priority really was the most important aspect of it. And then to get the technical people willing to pull away with tight government resources. Let's face it, states and locals are doing with less than they've done in a long time. And to get them to give us their time and resources was probably the most difficult part of it. But thanks to that cooperation, we're now in a much better spot. Matt?
I would just add briefly to that, that I think one of the things that was helpful in terms of the relationship, obviously, as the Secretary mentioned, the existing relationships, but after a number of meetings, as the BMV understood that we weren't asking them to change any of their processes. We were just asking to get a one-off of what they do, that we didn't want to get in their way, and to help them understand the advantages for the overall system of elections administration. Then they were able to come along. So I think it has been a growing relationship that I think we can expect additional good things in the future.
Okay. Thanks.
Commissioner Thomas?
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Secretary, I will say you've got one of the best staffs in the country. Done very well putting that together.
Thank you.
Matt, on your comment about the NVRA and file maintenance, working with the Kansas project, I wonder if you could speak to sort of the difficulties that law creates when we get data, for example, that would show somebody moved from Michigan to Ohio, They're not voting in Michigan, but they're voting in Ohio. They're on both of our registration lists, and what one can do with that, and the difficulty that the NVRA throws up to that.
Sure. Commissioner Thomas, I think there's two aspects there. One is the importance of data. As the Secretary mentioned, in Ohio, before our project, we didn't have complete data for all of our voters because many registered before the requirements of HAVA, so we didn't have driver's license for folks. In some cases, we didn't have the last four of their social. So those data points are essential for accurately matching registrations and information to know if it is indeed a match between Ohio and Michigan, or if it is indeed a match between Franklin County and Delaware County, even within Ohio. So having that information has allowed us to reduce duplicate records in Ohio and allowed us through Kansas and other states participating in ERIC, that I think you'll hear more about this afternoon, to do that. I think NVRA becomes a challenge because, as the Secretary noted, even if an election official becomes aware through the National Change of Address program or from a program such as the Interstate Match managed by Kansas, we can't really do anything about it until either a time period, a certain time period has elapsed, or the voter responds to one of multiple mailings that we've sent. So in the case of, I think a lot of states had that challenge in college towns. Students come in, register, want to participate in democracy in their community where they're now living, and then they move to another county, another state, and they remain on the rolls, and there's nothing that election official can do under NVRA and many state laws, even though we know the person's moved. In some cases, we know where the person moved to, but we just can't do anything to maintain the integrity of that list. Most cases, people aren't coming back to vote, but as the Secretary mentioned, it's one of those things that undermines the overall confidence when someone says, well, gosh, in Wood County, the census says there's only 100,000 people of voting age, but your voter rolls say there's 107,000 people on the rolls. Undermines confidence in the system.
Yeah, Kevin, I have a question for you because you guys do same-day voter registration, and there's a lot of pressure on a lot of states to implement that. And can you talk to me just a little bit about how it's working? I know it works well in your state, but how the impact on lines in a presidential election and exactly how all of that works?
Sure. We've had Election Day registration since 1976. We've actually leveraged it to take advantage of escape some of the federal mandates. We're exempt from the National Voter Registration Act, which once we went to a statewide voter registration system has allowed us to have a much cleaner roll without some of the issues. We can still take advantage of the matching programs you'll hear about later today. In presidential elections, about 16% of all the voters who show up at the polling, of all the voters, not all of those are showing up at the polling place, register or change their registration. Most of them are already registered voters. They're changing their registration. A lot of states already permit that at the polls on Election Day in some form. We get an identifying document from those individuals, and it's part of the planning that I was talking about. It's about knowing your numbers, knowing that 1 in 8 voters is going to have a change, particularly in urban areas where there's a lot of turnover. You prepare for that. Having flexible poll workers is another way that we do that. In Madison, it's not unusual to have more people coming in and working for the first 3 hours of the day and also the last 2 hours of the day and putting them on the registration table to do that. It's really an organizational thing, and by tracking our statistics the way we do, our local election officials have a good handle for that. It keeps our rolls pretty current too, because with that Election Day registration, we're able to make that change. Now, what we can't really do, which would be ideal, is if we had all 2,800 polling places wired, we could track them on Election Day, but, you don't own the polling places. It's not like the grocery store where your data is going to a central location every day. We're in temporary locations, so that's difficult. But we have municipal clerks who enter that stuff in on a computer and then upload it into the system. we try to take advantage of technology, but we've had the experience of doing this since 1976, and it's really been a tremendous convenience. It's cut down on provisional ballots. You talk about other states that work very hard to enable citizens to participate. The second chance voting, as Secretary Husted referred to. We had less than 200, out of 3 million people voting in 2012, we had less than 200 provisional ballots. And I'm not sure the poll workers properly issued those, because the only people who would get it would be an election day registrant who said, I have a driver's license, but I don't know the number. Or a first-time voter, someone who moved into Wisconsin and had never voted in the state before. Should be the only two people who get provisional ballots in the state. So it works very effectively, and like I said, it's helped us escape a number of federal mandates, because with the Help America Vote Act, we leverage that, and with the NVRA, we leverage that.
If I can just follow up, how long do they normally have to stand in line to register?
It really depends. Again, it's a planning issue. It doesn't take long to fill out the form. We often will give the forms to people waiting in line with clipboards to complete. We also, having high school students sit there with a computer and take the information from the voter and type it and print the form out right there, works very effectively. We've got a number of municipal clerks who've done that, and so all they do is sign. Our online registration process, we actually use that process for absentee voting in the clerk's office, and we can do that where you can go right into our voter registration system, get all your data entered, print the form out. The rolls won't get updated until we've done our DMV checks, but at least we've got the data there and save that entry. On election day, again, it's like someone walks into the polling place, they're asked, are you registered? We usually will use a greeter for that process. In big elections. In small elections, it really is not a problem. Big elections, we're catching them at the door, making sure they're at the right polling place, getting them over to the line if they need to update their registration or change it, making sure they have a form. So we're running parallel lines for that. In crowded polling places, we might have a couple of stations for election day registration. Again, it's all about planning. You know that the November elections are going to be bigger and the presidential are going to be the biggest. It's 10% for every other election or less for election day changes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Patrick.
Good morning. I have a question for Mr. Kennedy as well. Actually, it's a couple of questions, so if you'll indulge me. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the survey. It's fascinating coming from Arizona to hear about issues like snow piles. So my first question has to do with, of the things that were encountered on Election Day, how many were things like that, where even if you'd gone out and evaluated the facility, you didn't necessarily or wouldn't necessarily know that the facility would pile the snow up in that location? So how many of the issues that were encountered were temporary type problems, and how many were actually structural issues that could have or would have potentially been identified beforehand and could have been mitigated with some temporary accommodations or something along that line? I love the fact that you have the ratings as well, the kind of, color coding of it, the low, the high. And so I'm kind of interested in that part of it as well.
Well, it's actually kind of scary, because by actually having a very detailed survey, when you look at the numbers, you say, wow, that's a lot of problems. But most of them are temporary problems. They're, not having the right notices posted, the wrong size print. I mean, we've been focusing on accessibility since the mid-1980s, and what we learned was the self-survey that's done by clerks is not always accurate, and so that's why we went to, let's send people out. But we've taken the surveys that were done beforehand as a baseline, so that we're not just randomly going out. We're looking at where people self-identified, we're responding to complaints. But probably the high severity problems are temporary easy fixes. I mean, it's educating people. I mean, I think you heard this yesterday from talking about people with disabilities. It's very difficult to put yourself in the place of someone with a disability, and that's really part of what it's all about. I mean, you're not thinking, if you don't own the polling place, that maybe the snowplow operator just dump things over into the corner of the lot where the accessible parking spot was. You know, we didn't have that problem for our June recall. But
I would certainly hope not, although you do live in Wisconsin, so it's always a possibility, right?
But locked doors, it's an educational process. You know, again, if you don't own the polling place, the poll workers in advance need to be checking those doors to make sure that they're going to work. Sending people out is to record that. We do a follow-up, obviously. You know, we don't just get the data and let it go. We have a biennial report that goes to the legislature, and we've documented all the problems, and most of them are very easy to fix. And part of it really is raising awareness, but also we partner very closely with our disability community because we rely on them to do a lot of the outreach and communication directly with those 1,852 municipalities that are going to have that. We've done a lot to get rid of most of the structural problems. So most of it is a planning problem. And again, if it's not your facility, you need to have access to it in advance to make sure that you identified those problems.
The question I had to follow up really quickly then also is, what sort of response did you get from the local officials where you identified these issues in their areas that were things that potentially could have been prevented from occurring, like the signage being incorrect or locked doors, the sort of things that that could have been perhaps taken care of beforehand? What kind of response did you get from the local officials?
Well, it ranged from everything that you would expect from a human response. I mean, the best responses were, thank you, I wish I had thought about that, or I can't believe that that happened. Tell me what I can do, or, they like to order supplies. You know, we have stockpiled a number of supplies that they could use to make their polling places accessible. 2, you're wrong. You're damn wrong. Frustration that would go with that. We actually also would involve, if it's a town clerk, the town chair got a copy of the report, because oftentimes, the clerk didn't control that. The board chair ought to know what's going on, because it's going to be the town board that's going to have to make the change.
Well, and part of the reason
That created some, that creates issues, sometimes pitting people against each other, but that's what you do.
Commissioner McGeehan?
Commissioner Ginsburg, or Chairman, could I add something to this point? I imagine this is an issue that will be emerging in a lot of states. The polling locations that we use oftentimes are schools. And as schools confronting the issues regarding school violence and security measures that many schools are taking, they're making it becomes more and more difficult, and schools are less and less inclined to want to make those facilities locations for voting, because you have access from people coming in off the street. And this is an issue that we are beginning to confront, and I'm sure that this will be an issue in terms of locations where voting occurs that will emerge across the country. Thank you.
I had a question for Kevin Kennedy as well on the data collection that you do, and it sounds like you get a really good response from your locals, and I was curious, are there incentives? Does the state build in incentives for them to respond, or is it more like you rate the? Just curious how has it been a challenge to collect that data?
Well, it was always a challenge in the past because there was a lot of persuasive efforts that we would get involved in. And when it's paper-driven, it wasn't as efficient. You lose the paper. You wouldn't really, I sent that in. Well, having them do it online really increases the accountability. I will be frank that when we developed the tool, we bribed them. We offered them the first time $100 to try the system, and then we followed up with what were the pluses, what were the minuses. We don't do that anymore. We did that the first time, but it got them to use the system, got them involved. Now we shame them if they don't do it. I mean, I have no qualms if I've got a clerk, and there's a handful of clerks that, quite frankly, the staff goes, oh, it's the town of, and I won't say it here, again. It's usually we're waiting for 10 out of 1,852 municipalities to respond to that. And we had the same problem if we were trying to do data collection in response to lawsuits as well. But we will make sure that their presiding officer, their governing body knows that we've asked how many times. We'll make a record of the contacts we've had. Again, it is a challenge because 62% of those people are part-time. They may have a day job somewhere else. But this data is very important, and we found that it works very well. It allows me to throw out numbers all over the place here.
Mays?
Mr. Lewis, I'm struck by the contrast in your description of poll workers and that there is no choice to what we heard from the officials in Ohio. They look at corporate resources, charity groups, and yet you're saying if you're breathing, and even that may not be required, you qualify. And so why haven't other urban areas, because I come from corporate America, and I can tell you as I sit here, I don't ever remember working with any election officials about would we be willing to have certain members of our community go out and work. And I can almost guarantee you we could have pulled that off.
We have a number of urban jurisdictions around the country that do try to work partnerships with corporations, labor unions, civic clubs, to engage as many new or consistently good people as we can. You're still at a marginal rate on that in terms of some corporations take it to heart and do it really well, and some don't want to be involved at all. We even have problems getting county government to agree to let their own employees take a day off with pay and be an election worker. We have success in some counties in America, but we have a lot of them who say, oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to let them do that. And so it's still a struggle in our major urban areas. And let's face it, this is where our voters are. You know, I mean, I think you heard one of the research folks say yesterday, 5% of the counties have got, 70% of the voters. We're struggling in the urban areas to come up with enough all the time and to get them to commit to coming to training and to actually be trained and then to remember the training. If you're training poll workers in a major urban area to work on election day, in many instances you're training them 30 days out, 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out before you actually do the event, because you've got to have enough classes to train enough of them as you go along. And most of the poll workers that we live with are older folks. They're not the young corporate types. God love us, we'd love if every corporation in America would say, yes, this is a priority for democracy, but it doesn't happen that way. I think in all honesty, Matt and others will tell you that this is a constant struggle, trying to make this work. And so you get into areas like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or any of the ones where unless you've got some way of rewarding them beyond just their service, you don't always have enough to actually start out with. And then when you add in that percentage who just don't show up. You know, I always used to say I never wanted to be the mother of a poll worker because mother's health has been terrible, because the number one excuse we hear is my mother was sick, my mother was dying, I had to help my mother. And so you didn't want to be a mother of a poll worker because obviously it means ill health. So when we get to that election day and that 7% doesn't show up, you're scrambling at that point. Now you've recruited more. You've done everything you can do to recruit fill-ins and to have more folks, but trying to press them into service in a hurry in order to fill the position that is half a league away in terms of where the polling site is not an easy task. And so Los Angeles County employs somewhere between 25 and 30,000 of these folks on a regular basis, and I guarantee you, if they're breathing, they're serving. That's just where we are.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Bauer?
Yeah, thank you. I know we're running out of time here, so I'll be very quick. Secretary, you said on the school issue you just raised, We have had testimony on that, a number of questions that have been raised by localities about the difficulties of, as they see it, as school districts sometimes see it, of making the schools available. One of the issues that has come up, one of the questions that has come up is whether the answer doesn't lie in making the schools available for voting without security risk by scheduling teacher in-service days to coincide with election day so that children are not present, but maybe the administrative staff and the teachers are present and the voting takes place. Has there been a history of that debate in the state of Ohio? Do you have any thoughts on that for the commission?
We're only in the infancy of this discussion in Ohio. I can tell you that one of the things that has taken some of the pressure off of the need for locations has been our efforts with early voting. When you have 33% of the voters casting ballots before Election Day, that means that there are fewer voters turning out on Election Day, and so county boards have consolidated locations so that they need fewer of them, and they are trying to make good choices about having sustainable locations in making these decisions. So that's one of the things that's taken a little pressure off of it. But we're going to work with the schools and other people that have safety concerns. I raised it as it's something that we are currently taking under consideration, although I can't tell you that we have a solution to it at this point.
Thank you.
Chairman Bauer, it's also that the school boards have more influence with legislators than we do. And truth is more often than not, when we make these proposals, they make sure they get defeated. Parents are unhappy because they don't know what to do with their kids on that day, and the schools say that it means they've got to rearrange their calendars and what have you. And so until we can win the argument with the school boards, we've got a problem.
I could also add a positive note for why the schools want to work with us is because in many cases they have school levies on the ballot, and they like the idea of voters coming to the schools to make those voting decisions. So we have reasons why and why not these kinds of elections would occur at schools, and so the schools have been very cooperative in doing and having and I don't want to create any impression that that's not the case.
Final question to Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. I realize we're out of time, but Kevin, if you're doing post-election audits, could you provide the commission with a description of that and any reports that you get out of that? It's one of the issues we're looking at.
Sure, be happy to do that.
With that, thank you all very much. It's been a very helpful panel for us. We will reconvene in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're going to resume this morning. We are very mindful that we not only have a lot of ground to cover, but other people here also have schedules and have made generously available their time. So we've spoken to the panelists about limiting their opening remarks to 8 minutes, and this in turn provides the commission with the opportunity, which it very much wants to ask questions and still allow us to stay on the schedule for the rest of the day. So we have set up the odious timekeeping clock for your reference here as we go along and for your convenience. And we will begin with, we have an excellent panel here of very experienced witnesses in election administration. And we'll begin, as we often do on this side of the table, with Connie Schmidt from the Election Center. Ms. Schmidt.
Thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you all to discuss election administration in our country. My name is Connie Schmidt, and in December 2004, I retired as the Election Commissioner of Johnson County, Kansas. It's the largest county in the state of Kansas, located in the greater Kansas City metropolitan area. I want to begin today by talking about the development of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission's election management guidelines and quick start guides and their successful practices for poll worker recruitment, training, and retention. Dr. Britt Williams and myself were honored to serve as co-project managers for the Management Guideline Project. Under the guidance of the EAC Commissioners and Executive Director Thomas Wilkie, these guidelines became the nation's first resource library of election practices for use as operational standards and procedures at the state and the local level, and it was a project that was long overdue. In January 2006, a group of state and local election administrators agreed to serve as members of the steering committee for the management guidelines. They included officials from small, medium, and large jurisdictions representing users of a variety of different voting systems. The steering committee also appointed focus groups of election officials to serve as advisors and subject matter experts on each of the chapters of the guidelines. A total of 19 chapters were developed and distributed nationwide. We addressed the immediate need of election administrators by developing the Quick Start management guides. The Quick Starts were never intended to be a comprehensive management guide, but instead they provide a snapshot of priority items that were essential to managing elections. And we developed a total of 21 Quick Start management guides. From the smallest county of less than 2,000 voters to the largest jurisdictions of several million, the management guidelines now serve as a national resource manual for administrators of elections. Again, recognizing the importance of poll workers, the EAC also funded the development of the guidebook, Successful Practices for Poll Worker Recruitment, Training, and Retention. That guidebook was released for the first time in July 2007, and it provides a snapshot of poll worker recruitment, training, and management practices from across America. The guidebook was printed in what we termed a recipe book style. Election officials were encouraged to go there and pick and choose what might work for their jurisdiction, with examples of those practices from other jurisdictions depicted after each practice in the guidebook. In addition to the guidebooks mentioned above, the EAC also provides a wealth of resources, research studies, and statistical data to election administrators nationwide. Their website, eac.gov, provides basically an online library of information to election officials. The topics before this Presidential Commission actually mirror the topics that are covered within the pages of these guidebooks. Procedures in the business world are continually reviewed and updated. I believe it's now time to review and update these guidebooks to include the latest use of technology, improvements in accessibility needs, new procedures for military overseas voters, etc. It's important to remember that the federal agency that was put in place to accomplish this work is operational now and staffed, but continues to be stifled awaiting the appointment and confirmation of new EAC commissioners by Congress. I want to talk now briefly about some of my history, and I came from Johnson County, Kansas in 1992. Following redistricting, our county had very long lines during that presidential election. Those long lines led to approval of a new state law implementing no excuse advance voting, which is basically what we call early voting. Voters didn't have to choose. They could vote by mail or in person at any time for 20 days prior to the election. It was their choice, or they could wait to vote at their polling place on Election Day. The voters loved it. The most important lesson learned was that voters like having a choice. Our county, from that point on, never, ever experienced a long line on Election Day during a presidential election because of advance voting. Presently, the November 2012 presidential election has been referred to many as the perfect storm. Redistricting, new polling places, long ballots in some jurisdictions, coupled with new state election laws, all colliding at the polling place on Election Day. The end result in some jurisdictions was longer than expected lines. This year, I have been consulting with one of those jurisdictions, the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. A reduction in polling places, redistricting, and the impact of Election Day registration created long lines in many of their polling places. 1 in 4 voters chose to utilize Election Day registration in this city. In several precincts, the number of Election Day registrations equaled or surpassed the number of pre-registered voters. This tsunami of voters in these locations resulted in long lines, primarily because of the paperwork process that must be managed by the poll workers. We must all remember that the election process in the majority of jurisdictions nationwide is still very much a paper-based system at the polling place. For the future, the Election Center's Task Force on Election Reform issued a detailed report of recommendations following the November 2000 and again in the November 2004 presidential. Those reports are on the website electioncenter.org. After the November 2008 election, this same task force convened again to debrief ourselves. As a profession, we agree that improvements are still needed in several areas of election administration. And remember, this was after the November 2008 election. We said we need a comprehensive solution to the challenges that overseas voters face in receiving and returning their voted ballot. We need more federal funding for testing of voting systems. There remains a need to simplify polling place operations, and we need a continued investment in technology. States need to continue to improve access to voter registration by utilizing the internet and to improve data matching technology across state boundaries. We need to expand Election Day to a voting period and provide multiple methods to vote while continuing to explore the use of vote centers. There remains the constant need to improve recruitment and training of poll workers. Lastly, we need to enhance the statewide voter registration systems to better support what we call the start to finish of election administration beyond just voter registration. We need an election management system at the state level. In summary, a presidential election is unique. It happens once every 4 years and brings the largest number of voters into the process. Local jurisdictions are carrying the full financial responsibility for funding this election. One way to provide assistance in a presidential is for additional funding to be distributed to local jurisdictions to supplement their existing budgets. Now they would be able to have more polling places, more poll workers, and open and staff more early voting locations. Another idea is to promote a national civic duty day similar to a day of public service where businesses and corporations release their employees to serve as poll workers on Election Day. These public servants become our nation's internal army of election workers focusing on providing top-notch customer service to every qualified voter. We all know that if voters have a bad experience, it could impact their desire to ever vote again. It is our duty to ensure that all voters are able to cast their vote in a timely fashion with confidence that their voted ballot is secure and has been counted accurately. Thank you for your efforts on behalf of our nation's voters.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to David Orr from Cook County, Illinois. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate being invited. And I do hope that there will be dramatic impact to the work you do. Quickly, in terms of Cook County, we manage elections for about 1.4 million voters. In suburban Cook, we include about 126 municipalities and about 600 other units of government. We have a very long and very complex ballot. In our last election, April, a local election, we had 2,700 candidates, 800 ballot styles, 903 contests. Okay. You've already heard testimony in favor of many of the policies we already have: early voting, no fault, mail voting, electronic poll books. So I think rather than repeat those benefits, I'm just going to endorse them. I would like to cover a number of things that are up on the screen. I believe all the commissioners have that. So to save time, I won't mention them, except I'll start out by saying some of these are goals, some of these are warnings, and most of it's basically what I think are good practices that help us deal with things like resources on Election Day, lines, et cetera. So first, weekend holiday voting. It's something I favor. I believe it will expand the pool of available poll workers, remove time conflicts with the workday, enhance election authorities' ability to use important brick-and-mortar assets like public buildings. Altogether, these factors would enhance the voter experience, help reduce the lines, and hopefully boost the turnout. Next is the optimal voting locations, schools and public buildings. We've already spent some conversation in the last panel. So election authorities need access to schools, at least most of us, park districts and other school buildings, particularly in big urban areas, to hold efficient elections. They help in so ways. They have accessible entrances, modern wiring, internet connectivity, adequate space, sufficient lighting, and usually good geographic distribution. They also have classrooms and chairs, which is sometimes important for voters who have to complete paperwork or need to sit for a while. Removing students from the equation addresses concerns about security, traffic, and overcrowding. If Election Day does remain on Tuesday, I strongly believe that non-attendance days for students are essential for elections, whether schools are closed to everyone or superintendents opt for an institute day. This is working for us. In Illinois, the law says schools have to be available to us. It's true, schools are fighting this, some partly for the obvious security reasons, some for other reasons. What we seems to be working the most, and we have actually a significant number of schools doing this, is going for that no school day. So that way that the kids aren't there, there's room for the polling places, there's room for parking, and of course you don't have those safety issues. The next issue we call harvesting data, automated call form. This, I think, is probably the most important thing for us to have a handle on what is happening on Election Day and what do we do about it. Knowledge is power, and when it comes to election data, it gives you the power to manage voter wait times. About 10 years ago, we built a web-based data collection tool to capture, catalog, and share precinct operation data on Election Day in real time. This tool, the Automated Call Form, or ACF, gives us the power to realign our resources and improve our operations based on real knowledge. On all Election Day issues, from missing power cords to no-show poll workers, are entered into the ACF. Aggregated ACF data illustrates trends in our 1,700 precincts with their 9,000 poll workers and 10,000 units of piece of equipment. We use the ACF during early voting, but Election Day is when hundreds of users log in. They include 75 employees at our call center, field workers, more than 100 operators and technicians at 19 remote locations which service our precincts, and dozens of staff and lawyers and others who take calls about voter entitlement, locked polling places, etc. On Election Day, we log thousands of calls. Most are handled over the phone quickly and closed. Others stay open and are flagged for physical support or other follow-up. Through the ACF's proper use, that handoff is seamless and callers do not have to repeat their complaints. Remote site managers, the 19 sites that we use around the county, use the ACF data to efficiently allocate resources and route support visits. Each manager knows where a printer has been reported offline or an ACF call hasn't been closed. They allocate resources accordingly. Calls can be sorted by region, by precinct, by problem type, such as scanner issue or electioneering, and whether they are open or closed. They can be searched by issue or keyword, which keeps issues from getting lost because of an input error. Post-election, we can map calls by type and location to find patterns and optimize future resource distribution. And finally, we use ACF data to follow up with poll workers and conduct micro-training on identified deficiencies. An incorrectly completed form, a complaint, an imbalance in numbers, or a damaged equipment might all warrant micro-training. We try to push most of the data into the ACF so that it may also serve as an evaluative tool for not only individual poll workers, but for the teams working together. This includes tracking positive feedback about poll workers who do good things. Next is data-driven ballot density maps. Because the turnout for most elections varies so much, particularly in the local elections. You might have 5% turnout in one town, but you might have 65% in another town. To use data to predict turnout helps allocate resources. Turnout is a function of many things, including which contests are on the ballot. For example, in those 126 municipalities I mentioned, contested races drive turnout, and of course, mayoral races drive it the most. We note where those precincts are and allocate resources accordingly for the expected voter surge. We call this our ballot density analysis. After the election, we note the predicted to actual turnout and refine the model. We have plotted these trends on maps for a quick visual sense of where voters cluster. Just a word on online Election Day and automatic registration. You've talked a lot about it. We're glad that Illinois is joining that movement. By July of 2014, we will have online voter registration. This should increase registration, cut human error, and certainly reduce the costs. Integrated with e-poll books, online registration should improve list quality, reduce lines, and ease the transition to data sharing, both in between states and around states. I'm not going to take the time, but just mention I think Election Day registration is important, and at some point getting to automatic or universal registration. All of these goals that we have rely on better lists built from available data sets from DMVs and other government agencies. An efficient election day registration system would have a pre-populated form ready for eligible systems on election day. They would simply supply their signature. Interjurisdictional transfer of information, like NCOA updates, within a jurisdiction would also improve list accuracy and allow better service to voters. Projects like the Pew Center's ERIC are designed for this. Benefits of better lists include fewer provisional ballots, faster check-in time, fewer calls to Election Central, and fewer people disenfranchised. A quick word on mail ballot application. The registration I mentioned before, starting in 2014, allows us to make a change. In past elections, voters would have to download, and most of you, of course, know this, and print a mail ballot application. Next election for us in Illinois, they'll be able to skip that step and simply apply online. We'll have a quicker turnaround and better service for our voters. Finally, online national voter information tool. Informed voters produce better elections. For more than a decade, my office has maintained a robust website with everything from a voter guide to a voter information tool to let each voter check their registration, ballot, polling place. Last year, we unveiled a mobile voter tool to provide this information on the fly. These assets help each voter to get to the right place at the right time, prepared to vote for the right ballot, at least in the right ballot. A national online voter information tool that provides any voter in the U.S. with that kind of essential data would be tremendously enhancing the voter experience. I have other concerns, relevant, just touch on it very briefly. I do think it would be important to see if we can build a stronger national election administration agency. I do believe we should try and work on, we can call it universal, whatever we want, but for example, early voting. I do think it's important to have standards, if you want to call them rules, you don't want to call national requirements, but is it fair to have some jurisdictions with lots of early voting sites and some with almost none simply because of money? It's also, if there's no real regulation of these things, abuse can and does happen in the selection of sites and how those are handled. Anyway, I believe working on those two things would make things better. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Orr. And now we turn to Commissioner of Elections in Iowa, Dawn Williams. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dawn Williams. I've been privileged to serve the 27,000 registered voters of Marshall County, Iowa since 1988. As the Commission follows your mission to seek to formulate best practices for the consideration of election administrators around the country, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk to you about the Election Center's Best Practices Program. It's under the umbrella of the Professional Education Program. Best practices have been part of the Election Center's National Convention for 18 years now. I testify before you today with a firm belief that the sharing of best practices is one of the most effective ways to improve our profession and how we serve our voters. To those of you on the commission that are not from the election community, I think it's important to point out an integral part of our culture. Because we're forced to operate in an environment that demands perfection with unrealistic timelines and limited resources, the election community has elevated the case method, copy and steal everything, to the highest form of art. Best practices programs are the perfect platform to do this. It's my belief that the structure of the Election Center's program enables election administrators to draw the maximum benefit out of a program of best practices. It's an open exchange of ideas. It comes from all corners of our country and from jurisdictions large and small. Participants are invited to submit a paper. They're reviewed by a 4-person panel. Winners are selected and invited to attend and present their paper at the national conference. In addition to the formal presentations, we have breakout sessions, science fair style, where conference attendees and the presenters can interact and ask questions and exchange business cards and everything. Get the beginning process going for sharing of those ideas further. A successful best practices program will stimulate new programs. In 2008, we expanded our categories to spark additional ideas, encourage jurisdictions to submit multiple practices, we'll be making additional awards in the coming years to seek out ideas from smaller jurisdictions, encourage them to participate more. And we will also be making awards in areas that we deem topical of how things are at the moment, at a specific moment in time. Practices submitted to our program absolutely demonstrate how today's election administrators are in sync with the guiding principles of your commission. The guiding principle to make voting work for voters is evidenced as follows. Osceola County, Florida submitted a paper. They used tablet technology to provide for a more streamlined and efficient voter check-in process at the polls. A paper submitted by Davis County, Utah developed, it was titled Equipment Officials Resources, How Much, How Many, Made Easy. It provided a simple Excel utility to have consistent and efficient resource allocation. The guiding principle to provide common sense, nonpartisan solutions can be found in many best practices. Maricopa County, Arizona developed a GIS public redistricting interface. It allowed for public input with their redistricting process, something we all know can be really partisan. Cerro Gordo County, Iowa developed Precinct Atlas, and they partnered with their Secretary of State to distribute the program free of charge to other counties. Focus on providing election administration as customer service can be seen in these examples. A Forsyth County, Georgia submission, Early Voting Wait Time Dashboard, addressed wait times before wait time became a buzzword. Contra Costa County, California, Best Practice Vote by Mail Rejection Reduction Program demonstrated their commitment of excellence. They went back to their process time after time to continue to increase the successes of their program. Complete best practices programs can be found on the Election Center's website from 2003 forward. I've provided the link in your packet. I'm happy to announce we've also got some big improvements coming to how we distribute the practices after the program. It is through an alliance between the Election Center and Auburn University to improve election administration in our country that the team at Auburn has begun a project that will enhance the value of our program. Dr. Kathleen Hale, Director of Masters in Public Administration Program and the Election Administration Program at Auburn University, program faculty, and graduate students in the Department of Political Science recognize that the sharing of best practices is vital to the growth of our profession. Their project to scan and index our best practices will establish a clearinghouse for the 18 years of practices that have been submitted to date, and this clearinghouse will be housed on the Election Center's website. Best practices are a powerful resource as long as they're used. I've asked people, and they are used. When I asked Sacramento County, California, they quickly cited 4 best practices that they have recently implemented or are in the process of beginning a program. It benefits their organization and it benefits their voters. My own experience illustrates that our universal goal as election administrators, to promote the public trust and by our conduct of accurate and fair elections has a common thread. That common thread proves that a best practice submitted for a jurisdiction of 750,000 voters is relevant to a jurisdiction of 27,000. I was impressed by a 2008 Clark County, Nevada submission. It featured an innovative way to deal with a facility shortage. They mobilized 48-foot trailers. They used them for mobile early voting sites. Last year, when I needed satellite voting sites that I could place in politically neutral locations, I remembered the Clark County example. I modified it to fit my jurisdiction, and because of their best practice submitted 4 years earlier, I was able to serve my voters in an easily accessible and politically neutral location. A multitude of examples can be discovered if you match the best practices submitted to our program with what you see in our country today. Finally, I'd like to bring it home by reflecting on how I view the program. I realize that each practice I review finds me feeling like a new kid on a ride at Disney World. It starts with anticipation of a new discovery. It builds to a wow. Then I wonder how they did it. I want to talk about it, and I want the people around me to be as excited as I am by it. I think wow again, and then I want to do it over again. I bet you're wondering how I got from the black and white world of election administration to the Technicolor world of Disney. It's a pretty direct route when you think about it. They both start with vision and dedicated individuals. Execution requires that a balance be struck between our ideal world and reality. Both take a little magic. Our guests deserve and we demand perfection. At the end, we want our guests to view it as a pleasant and rewarding experience, and we want them to come back again. Thank you for the opportunity to share this passion of mine. It's an honor to be here today. And finally, thank you for your dedication to improving our system by your service on the commission.
Thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to Neil Kelly from Orange County.
Good morning. I would like to express my gratitude to the Commission for giving me the opportunity to share my experiences and lessons learned as an election official in Orange County, California. As the 5th largest voting jurisdiction in the nation, Orange County is extensive both in its size and its diversity. In the 2012 general election, over 1 million votes were cast, necessitating the production and delivery of 1.6 million sample ballots, 675,000 vote-by-mail ballots, the deployment of 11,000 voting booths, and the recruitment of over 10,000 poll workers. It is both an honor and a challenge to be responsible for providing high-quality election services supported in 5 languages to Orange County's 3 million residents of varying cultural, generational, and socioeconomic backgrounds. In light of these challenges, I am proud that Orange County has been referred to as a leader in the field of election administration. However, I'm also aware that that's not always been the case. Like many others, in years past, the office experienced difficulties effectively communicating with voters and volunteers, efficiently mailing and tallying ballots, and keeping pace with technology. That began to change in 2005, and great strides have been made to drastically improve election operations and the voting experience. And it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to highlight some of those innovations we've made in Orange County. However, as far as we have come, more progress is needed. I echo the comments of my colleagues in that regard, and for this reason, I'm grateful to the Commission's efforts to improve the experience of voting and increase voter engagement throughout the country. There are 4 areas of innovation I'd like to focus on this morning. I'd like to begin talking about how Orange County has embraced technology as a means of improving voter education and engagement. In 2011, we redesigned our website to make it more intuitive and functional for voters. This was not simply a redesign, it was a fundamental change in how voters interacted with our office. It was a reimagining of that entire process. As you can see from this graphic, we created a voter portal, allowing voters to access all of their specific voter information using a single entry point and viewed on an easy-to-use display, whether mobile or on their website on their computer. It's truly interactive. Citizens can register to vote, view and update voter registration information, look up the status of provisional ballots, view individualized sample ballots and other precinct-level data pertaining to districts and elected officials. These enhancements to the website's functionality have improved communication with voters and contributed to a public that is better informed about the elections process. This is evidenced by the steady decline in call volume with the rise in visits dramatically to our website. The data between call volume declining and web visits increasing is dramatic, as you can see from this image on the screen. The redesigned website has additionally increased efficiencies in the management and operation of polling places. By integrating the Google geocoding tool, our website allows voters to ascertain their polling place location, provides a map and route information from their home address, and more importantly, relays information about expected turnout and wait time at their polling place in real time on Election Day. By providing this information, voters are able to make quick, informed decisions about when and how they will vote, which not only reduces polling place wait times, but improves the overall voting experience. Increasing the accessibility of information is one of many steps taken to make voting a more positive and rewarding experience. Other efforts have involved conducting time studies to identify bottlenecks at polling places, streamlining how voters are processed, improving poll worker training, and promoting our vote-by-mail program. By making significant investments, the accessibility and popularity of vote-by-mail has increased dramatically in Orange County. It has been a strategic priority for me to invest in technology that has automated 80% of our vote-by-mail process to date. This has improved service delivery and the return of processing of the ballots. The graphic you see here shows the correlation between the investment in technology and automation and the increase in the use of vote-by-mail voting as an option. The delivery of every ballot is tracked, and voters are able to verify the status of their vote-by-mail ballot on our website. Further, complicated and confusing instructions have been simplified, and voters are now provided information explaining the most common errors to avoid, resulting in the rejection rate of vote-by-mail ballots due to voter error dropping by half since 2007. Paired with convenience, the high level of confidence voters have in the program led to vote-by-mail ballots making up over half of the ballots cast in Orange County in the presidential election. The effective administration of the vote-by-mail program is critical to ensuring that the right to vote is readily accessible for all eligible voters. For many of our voters, casting a ballot at a physical polling place is difficult, if not impossible, due to issues such as disability, transportation, and employment. While Orange County is dedicated to ensuring equal access to the ballot box for all voters, we are especially mindful of the distinct challenges faced by uniform and overseas voters, for whom approximately 8,000 ballots were issued in Orange County in the 2012 election. Whether a first-time voter living abroad or a troop serving in a combat zone, guaranteeing the right to vote is paramount. To improve this process, we've developed a unique portal to assist military and overseas voters to receive and cast their ballot. This screenshot shows the tools we have developed for our overseas and military voters. Through this unique portal, it's possible to register to vote, verify and update your military or overseas status, print a ballot online, request future ballots via email, and one of the more popular features on there is to secure your email address so that troops serving overseas are not concerned about entering their military email on our website. We keep it off the public rolls. Technology has proven to be a valuable tool in furthering efforts to increase voter education and removing barriers to facing that voters face to citizens with military and overseas voters. Commissioner Mays, you spoke briefly about corporate sponsorship or corporate interaction. We have a very robust corporate sponsorship program in Orange County, and I just want to highlight Sprint, Wells Fargo, and Enterprise Rent-A-Car are partners of ours in that endeavor. And so I want to talk about poll workers. I'm going to focus on students, but want to let you know that we're involved in that corporate side as well. Technology is one of many strategies used in Orange County to increase voter engagement and participation in the electoral process. In-person community outreach has been a crucial means of voter education and voter recruitment. And in 2008, we developed a program entitled My Ballot. It's a one-of-a-kind, unique high school student election program that has transformed our student poll worker recruitment. The expansion of voting rights through laws and grassroots advocacy is fundamental to the history of the United States, yet many students do not fully appreciate the power of voting nor the struggle many have endured to obtain that sacred right. For this reason, the My Ballot program was created, providing a unique opportunity to partner with high schools and educate students about the evolution of voting rights. And the program consists of three important components. First, students are provided an in-class presentation on the history of voting and how elections are conducted. Second, and the most popular, the students are brought to our facility where they're taught how to build a ballot on our ballot building system. They're amazed at what it takes to actually create a ballot and the technology that's used. And then finally, we take the ballots that they've created and go back to their school, put it on our voting system, and allow them to vote in their student elections on the ballot that they created. Those ASB students then tally the votes, and they learn how to tally those as well. As students vote, they're encouraged to participate in the county student poll worker program. That's the selfish part for me. The valuable program allows student volunteers to share their enthusiasm and technical skills with their community while they gain firsthand knowledge of the electoral process. While educating and engaging new and future voters, My Ballot is helping to revitalize Orange County's pool of volunteer student poll workers. Student poll workers now make up one-third of all of our poll workers in Orange County. We had nearly 1,000 My Ballot participants served as volunteers in 2012, which was up 30% from 2010. And you can see from the graphic there that there's been a strong correlation between the program itself and the increase in our student poll workers over time. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope the information I've shared will help advance your mission of improving the voting experience for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to Wendy Noren from Boone County, Missouri. Welcome.
This on. Although you could probably hear me, even if I didn't have it on. I am very honored to be here, and I appreciate the work you're doing. I've seen lots of commissions over the years, and I do think it's very healthy. It's kind of like, I've also seen lots of space utilization studies. You know, it seems like every 5 years, my county hires somebody to do space utilization, where we go look at everybody's space and do we need a building. It's good to have a good look at something like that. What are you doing? What are your needs and those things? So I appreciate the time you're doing on this. I have been asked to discuss engaging young voters. I am the county election authority in Boone County, which is Columbia, Missouri, home to the University of Missouri, Columbia College, Stevens College, and several junior community colleges, they call them now. Anyway, I think Doug Lewis a lot of time tries to say people didn't really go into elections. I did from an early age, went into election. I'm probably, most of my generation knows where they lived when John Kennedy was shot or where they were. I am so strange. I know exactly where I was when the 26th Amendment passed, and spent the next 4 years trying to get student voter registration drives. I don't think anybody would be surprised. I got into an argument with my county clerk when I tried to register at 17, and he wouldn't let me. Anyway, probably the last time my Secretary of State agreed with me, the one then, and it's been on from there. I take very seriously being the chief election official in a college town. Over my career, I believe a person's first interaction with an election process is going to color their outlook for the rest of their life. If I can't serve them well, they may never rejoin the system, or they may wait 20 or 30 or 40 years before they get back into the process. And so I try to train all my staff, all my poll workers, that when you have a young person come in, what you're doing is how they feel on that day, and their treatment is going to be what they feel about elections and their government for many years to come. Because I've handled over half of the people's registrations I've done in my career have been 18 to 24-year-olds, close to 200,000. Okay. So how have they changed? Well, I have learned it's not possible to keep up with them. It's not possible to stay ahead of them. I'm just trying not to stay too far behind. And so over the years, they push me. I knew in 1999 students wanted more out of a website than looking up information. They were already into transactional websites. So before the 2000 election, we started allowing voters to change their address online. In a college town, you tend to have to meet the needs 5 to 10 years earlier than the general population of technology. And so what I have been doing tends to you'll start to see cropping up several years later. By 2003, people wanted to get their sample ballots by email, rather than mail. So we started emailing sample ballots, polling place notices out to voters. 2004, absentee ballots. People wanted to know, did I get their ballot? Did I get their application? Did we count their ballot? So every absentee application that comes into my office, they get an email. We got it. We sent it. We received it. I really think people, and I know a lot of people have websites, the voter can go to the website and look it up. Well, when I go buy shoes from Zappos doesn't make me keep coming back to their site to see if I ordered it. They don't make me, they send me an email. We got your order. They send me an email. It's shipped. They send me an email. Here's this. And so I look at my interaction, what I want out of shopping experiences, my insurance provider, all of these things in how people want to react to a website. 2008, put in a front-end online voter registration. We still had to print and email the application. Now, one of the problems has been for me is, you always got to get around these pesky little laws. It's just like, it used to be, before term limits, I could write a piece of legislation, take it down to the guys in research and say, Roger wants this, and it would go up to committee and Roger would say, fine. And, they don't know me as well. And so, you've got to get around it. I just can't be stopped, It's like I'm going to find some way. So I know a lot of people say, well, we can't do online change of addresses because the law says they have to be in writing. Well, they aren't a real official change of address till they show up at the polling place and sign it. So it's an interim change that's held out here. But the voter doesn't know it. Now they know the polling place. I'm not getting 15,000 calls on election day because I've made it easy for people. They get an email from me with their sample ballot. Is your address correct? Click the button. If it's not, it goes directly to their record. They enter their new address. They're done. It's that kind of thing that they don't have to try and find me. On Tuesday for National Voter Registration Day, and here's my latest. We all think we have to get a signature, a wet signature on the registration form. If we don't do that, it's not that. Well, so that's been my thing. I've got to get that through the legislature because I looked at it as law in Missouri. Well, I thought a chicken or the egg. First, I'll develop the way they sign it, then I can take it to the legislature and show it could be done. Here's how cool it is. People just sign their iPads. In my research, guess what? The Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, which 46 states have adopted. And in that, it is the most broadly worded thing. If the law requires a signature, an electronic signature shall be valid. If a record is to be, returned, and it is so broad. So there I have it. That is all the statutory authority I need because it covers every government document in my state. It covers state government. It covers county government and all of those things. So again, it's rolling out on Tuesday. They'll be able to get online. It will then bring up a PDF. They can use an app to sign their PDF and send it back into me. I've got a lot of things on poll workers. I'll have recommendations for you on emerging issues with students. They don't know where they live. They've never dealt with mail. I asked a group of them, have they ever mailed anything in their life? No. All right, so they don't know where they live. If they have no idea what to do with mail, then how do they know where they live? And you all are going to see this. So I see all these sites, state sites, that require somebody to put their name and their house number. They don't even know their house number. It's like, so I get address where you live, the Grove, the Den, the this, the that. It's some of them make up a place. And you're seeing this more and more. It's kind of like, I grew up in a world where telegrams were kind of this archaic little thing, and I used to like to send telegrams. I thought they were cool. But, mail and how we want them to interact with us is like a telegram was for my generation, and you got to move forward. Everything I do, I deal with kids electronically. The poll worker program, 40% of my poll workers are college students. And it's only because they can go online, sign up, pick their polling place, pick their training time. They can go back and change it. The only thing I've got to add to that is text them to tell them to read their email. Because, again, I got to keep up with them. They got a little ahead of me. They don't read their email until somebody texts them and tells them to read their email. So I have a bunch of recommendations I'll send to you.
Yeah, and please do, and we'd like to see all of them.
Okay.
Thank you. I could also, in particular, I think Co-Chair Ginsburg would like you to elaborate on the ingenious way that you found around what you called pesky laws. I got to He thought he had the market on that, and now he...
I am my legal counsel's worst nightmare,
or his warmest inspiration.
No, he's wonderful. He really is wonderful.
Thank you very much, very much. And now we'll turn to questions from the commission. Commissioner Lomax and Commissioner McGeehan.
Neil, you mentioned that you have a system by which you you input your waiting times at the various polling places on Election Day. How do you go about measuring that? How often do you measure it? And then how do you get them into some database that the voters are looking at?
Thank you, Commissioner. So there's a number of data points that we use to calculate that, including historical turnout, ballot density like David uses. We also use information from the poll workers on Election Day that they put information into a mobile device. So we're getting a lot of data inputs into this process that we are calculating on Election Day throughout the day. So when a voter, and I agree with you, Wendy, that most voters don't know where they precinct at, or they don't know a lot of information to enter, so we make it simple. They can just enter their name and the last 4 digits of their driver's license. Once they do that, then they get that predicted wait time based on all of that data that's coming into us.
Does anyone actually go out there and, measure it? You give a voter at the end of the line a card or something, and then when he gets there, you...
We don't do that. We have some metrics we use from the field supervisors that are out there so that they're going out and making some determinations whether the data is valid or not. And we're actually doing a pretty good job on making sure that that data is, within a couple of minutes, is pretty accurate.
Okay.
Commissioner.
Yes, this is a question for you, Wendy, and it doesn't relate directly to your testimony, but at other commission meetings, we've had testimony that Missouri is a really good example of a state that has implemented NVRA through the disability agencies, that in recent years the numbers have gone up significantly. Are you familiar with that? And if I'm catching you off guard...
I do, there was a lawsuit in Missouri that was, I believe, Project Vote and some other groups filed a lawsuit in 2006, I believe, 2007 maybe, against the state of Missouri for their failure to implement NVRA. A lot of the groups did. That lawsuit was heard by Judge Lowry in the 8th District out of Kansas City, and she did issue an order against the state of Missouri for their failure to properly implement NVRA, in particular in the social service agencies and the disability agencies. And we did see, between the time the judge's order came out and between the 2008 election, I saw a marked increase. I mean, I was seeing none. And I was sending a staff member over to those places every Thursday morning to pick up things and ask them, don't you have these? And so I think Missouri had a very miserable thing with it until Judge Lowry ordered the state to implement the programs. And, I am actually a believer. I'm going to say one of my recommendations, I have an if-then. I'm a programmer. See, all these things, these programs, I write them myself. So I'm kind of an if-then-else. If you all want same-day voter registration, let's see how you deal with that. One of the best ways, I think, would be to exempt states from NVRA, because a lot of states hate it. They think it's costly. I think we all recognize those states that have same-day registration have higher turnout. A lot of us felt like, these NVRA agencies were going to be problematic. In fact, the original version of NVRA had an exemption for all states that adopted same-day registration. And I had a bill working, I act like a legislator, but, I used to behave like one. It was ridiculous. But there was a bill moving through the legislature that in 93, so we could be exempted from NVRA. Unfortunately, the final version of NVRA said you had to have adopted prior to May 11th, 1993, which stopped the movement of states to go to go to same-day registration. I think that would have moved many, many states to that. So there's this connection there of the cost, state agencies not wanting to do it. We're seeing a decreasing number of these applications coming in from these agencies as turnover occurs, that type of thing. But, clearly the data from 2006 to 2008, probably through 2010, would have been an incredible increase in NVRA, but you need to credit Judge Lowry rather than much of anything else.
Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. I have a question for Connie and then one for Wendy. So Connie, those management guidelines, which are really one of the best compilations in the country, if the EAC is not going to continue, do you have a suggestion on how or where those could be continued?
So your question is, if the EAC is no longer in place, what happens to the work products?
Yes.
That's a good question, because that hurts me, because I felt very strongly from my heart. Because when I took my job in Johnson County, Kansas, there was no reference manual. I learned it the hard way. And there are county clerks who are elected across the country into a position of election administrator, and they have no experience in the election world. So the goal was to put a resource manual in place that people could go to and familiarize themselves with everything they needed to know. I went to the city of Milwaukee to a brand new election director there to ask questions about poll worker training, and I gave her some handouts when we were doing pilot projects for that guidebook. She almost hugged me right there on the spot, because around on the floor she was trying to invent this because she was new. And here I stood holding the documents that she needed, and it was powerful. And it is very much needed, and it needs to continue in some way.
I agree. So Wendy, yesterday there was testimony, and I think you were at the round table, about how college students, younger people, are aware of the problems with doing business on the internet and would know better than doing that?
I believe the gentleman was from MIT, and maybe the college students at MIT in computer classes are more aware of security issues in the internet. Believe me, these kids do everything on the internet. I mean, I sit and talk to them sometime. I'll see some kids at the coffee house, and they are like putting their credit card in a public Wi-Fi system. I said, got any idea about the problems with maybe doing that? They don't, their world is these devices. Maybe they'll become more aware of it, I don't know. But I really do believe. The other issue is, we aren't teaching kids handwriting anymore. You all realize they have stopped cursive. So in fact, my attorney said, well, why in the world are you even getting a signature? The Electronic Act just says click. I said, well, I got to have a signature to check for petitions and things like that. Look at any 2, 3-year-old kid with their parents, and they're sitting with the iPhone dropping down. I mean, it's amazing. They aren't going to waste time teaching these kids how to sign their name, how to write stuff. These kids are going to be like this from day one. I mean, the New York Times had the article on the front page about how they're moving all of the an iPad in every school. It's going to happen. Our high schools have moved to it. In my town, they're doing it junior highs. And over the next 5 years, every student will be working on a tablet. So, I guess there are college kids at MIT who've done all of the studies and learned how to hack. Your typical English major, they have no clue. They're doing stuff out there. But let's be honest. How many of us, I don't do anything on the internet. I couldn't live without the internet. I couldn't function without the internet. So we are all guilty. I put a credit card in on there. I guess it's okay, I don't know. But we give up certain things for the convenience of doing things the way we want to do them. And they do too, even more so than I would. I wouldn't put my credit card on a public Wi-Fi network, but they.
Commissioner Ginsburg, do you have any questions? I have a question for Mr. Orr and one for Ms. Kelly, Ms. Williams, rather, if I could. Mr. Orr, could you talk a little bit, because you talked about the schools as a well-equipped facility for polling locations that has connectivity and space, chairs for people who need to sit and the like. What is the history of the state's engagement with the school system that accounts for the success of or any frustrations that you've encountered in being able to recruit these sites, get the cooperation of school boards to have these sites available to you for this purpose?
Well, I can't speak as much for the state. The state, in their wisdom, decided that historically public schools should be polling places. All across the state, and of course it varies, and I can't speak for all the counties. I would say a very experienced Republican county clerk in a large county near Chicago said on the same issue, you take away the polling places, you take away the election. You take away the schools from polling places. So I think most, and I can't speak for all, most find that whatever percentage they have, whether it's 25% or 34%, is critical. What we've tried to do, because issues always come up, the schools, maybe the security issue, it may be the rebuilding, all sorts of things. We try and work with them, but we have that law on our side. But because of security, the best thing we try and do is to work with them to say, listen, we all know there's lots of days when the kids are not in school. So if you plan ahead, we've given them schedules all the way to 2020. Would you plan ahead so that as you're planning for 2014, 2015, et cetera, that give us 2 days. Plan ahead to either have the Institute Day where the kids are there. That's not as good for us, it's fine, because I want the whole banana. Earlier in your last panel, you were talking about the shortage of good poll workers. Just think, in the Chicago area alone, if we didn't have school that day, and that means kids were gone and the teachers were off, talk about 20, 30,000 educated teachers and other administrators who would be available if we could get them. So there is tension, but we're moving toward trying to encourage them to take that day off, plan it ahead. There was legislation introduced in Illinois recently to ban schools as polling places. Fortunately, that did not go anywhere in the legislature. But there is tension, and we do need those sites until we reach the point where people are voting on their phones and they're not coming to the polls at all.
So is there, on the question of tension, is it primarily around the security issue, or is it, are there any other points of resistance that you've had to address that you successfully negotiated?
We negotiate sometimes individual schools. We may, here's the problem. You've got a gravel driveway over here, but you make the entrance in the back, which means the wheelchair person has to go in the gravel driveway. So there's all sorts of negotiations like that. The primary thing not only is security, which has been increased, obviously, because of the recent events. We don't have a, quote, universal policy. We try and deal with each school and politely convince them, which usually works, that they need to continue it. And other cases, we use legal reasons to say you need to continue it. But the thing that works the most is when they will say, you know what, why bother with all this? We will say on November 14th or whatever the day is, we will just not have the kids in school. So that's our chief negotiating goal. It works some of the time, not all.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I add real quickly to that?
Certainly.
David's points are well made, and I just want to say in Orange County, with respect to schools, it sounds very basic, but negotiating where those sites are on campus is critical. Because I can't tell you how many times a principal or a vice principal will change the polling place location to the back of the school. And then you have those voters walking through the kids all the way through to the back of the polling place. So the negotiation part is critical on where that site is.
Very good. Thank you. Ms. Williams, on the best practices sharing, you said they are used. In other words, you have all this wealth of information. It's continuously being revamped, improved, revised, and you're having success in distributing it in a way that enables them to be effectively used. And I'd be interested, since eventually we may produce recommendations that we hope would be helpful, if you could talk a little bit about what has worked best to make sure that you are able to disseminate effectively these best practices. You know, do you have different approaches to ones of different visibility or significance, and how do you engage the larger community in sort of seeing, working with, being able to ask questions about the best practice work that you do?
Because our program is part of the Election Center's national conference, we have a fairly big audience once a year. It is the part of the election community that is normally more engaged in the process anyway, that I do acknowledge that. But between the in-person presentation of the practice, between we distribute it on CDs to every conference attendee, then it goes up on the Election Center's website. You can go back and look. We are looking toward delivering it in every possible way, but there are always improvements. And I think the way that we can improve the most is to figure out how to deliver it to the jurisdictions that aren't engaged in the betterment of the community like the Election Center officials are. And that may be a way that the commission can, use your influence and get to those that are less often engaged.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question from, lost the Commissioner McGeehan. Oh, Commissioner Mace, apologize.
I just have to make one observation, and then I have a question for Ms. Noren. This is as long as 7 years ago. I was rushing to the airport, and I had to get something mailed because I live in New York City, so a lot of the mailboxes don't exist at the airport. I gave it to this young woman in the elevator. I said, "Can you mail this for me?" Her response was, "Where's the mailbox?" So now this is my question for you. If you see technology as responding to a lot of the issues that the Commission is grappling with, what is your impression of the impact on funding? Because the resources and funding are always just under siege for elections. And when I look at what happens in corporate America, it may be cheaper when you do your first transition, but as you stay on that platform, it gets more and more expensive as you try to upgrade and keep pace with whatever the innovations are. So how will this area deal with that stress of needing more money?
And I don't know if anybody said this to you all before, but, we actually have entrusted to county government basically, in most of this country, the funding of elections. And county government is, in most cases, the poorest unit of government. In most states, we have the least taxing authority and those kinds of things. And you're very right. Not only, when I put in electronic poll books, it was not just a matter of the initial cost. The printer goes out, this one goes out. I'm in the process of looking at replacing them all with iPads. The technology of tablets is very, very difficult to maintain when you've got iOS, Android. I'm trying to look at a non-device specific solution. But you're right, you've got to have somebody who works on this stuff full time. Every time you do it, you've got to check stuff on everybody's device. Does my system work on Foxfire, IE6, IE7? Does it work on Chrome? Does it work in this? And it is way too complex for most election offices. I'll be very honest. I'm a wacko. You need a lot of money. I'm stressing over IBM's working with me. It'll be the first time I've paid for consulting services because I don't know how to move this stuff to the iPads on my own. We need infusion of cash. think about this. The elections are very similar to the census. You do exactly the same thing. You're counting. They have the distinct advantage of a 10-year period to prepare for it. They ask the same 5 questions to every single household. Census Day is April 1, like Election Day, is what if the Census Bureau had to report the results by the 10 o'clock news? How accurate would they be? They've got a full year to get county level data out, and I used to work for the Census Bureau, so I know, But would they spend $50 billion the federal government spent on the census? Just take half of that. 2 presidential elections in a 10-year period. That's $20 billion worth of technology that maybe we could use. If you want to fix that, maybe think of doing something like that. We aren't going to fix this on the cheap. It costs money to fix these things. And, when I say on the cheap, Senator Eagleton, that was his thing. The problem with a lot of these issues is we want to fix them on the cheap. And most things can't be fixed on the cheap, particularly when we want to do the kinds of things and communicate with people that way.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the entire panel for an excellent exchange, and we know we'll have follow-up from some of you, and would much appreciate it. Thank you very much. We'll go to our next panel immediately. Thank you.